A while back when I made that Why Nobody Plays Jar of Greed video, I briefly mentioned, just as an aside, that Upstart Goblin, despite being really close to Jar of Greed, actually saw way more play. In fact, Upstart Goblin, when it was at 3 copies per deck, saw play in pretty much every single competitive strategy for years, with some players swearing by always running 3 copies in every single deck. And when I said that, I didn't think too much of it. However, I got a ton of comments, not only about Upstart Goblin, but just all of the draw 1 cards in general, like Jar of Greed, like Legacy of Yatagarasu, and I got comments from people and questions from people saying, well, what's the point of playing those cards anyway? Obviously that video was about why nobody plays Jar of Greed, but seeing I brought up Upstart Goblin, what's the difference between those 2 cards, and why did Upstart Goblin see so much play? Because to many people, and I totally get this, and I'll explain this in this video, many people just thought, well, if you play the Upstart Goblin, you're just drawing the card that you would have drawn without the Upstart Goblin, and that might seem true, but it's not quite true, and let's talk about that in today's video. So first off, you have to understand that Upstart Goblin isn't seeing as much play in 2018 as it did even just a couple years ago, mainly due to the fact that it's limited, but I'm also going to talk about some strategies that are still using the card, some of the benefits from it, even at 1 copy per deck, and also talk about some reasons that people aren't playing that card anymore. But first off, let's focus on why the card was played at 3 copies per deck. So it might seem like you'll just draw the card anyway, but what Upstart Goblin allows people to do is play quote-unquote less than a 40 card deck. And what I mean by that is that if you play 37 normal cards and then 3 copies of Upstart Goblin, you are essentially playing a 37 card deck. Now you're obviously not writing that on your deck list or anything, but because the Upstart Goblins are blank cards that you just activate as soon as you draw them, you then have a slightly increased chance of drawing each individual card in your deck. I don't know the math offhand, but I believe that out of 1,000 games you will see a card 3 more times, and that might not seem like a lot, but over the course of a long tournament or even many tournaments, that 3 out of 1,000 can boost your win percentage by just a little bit, and sometimes that little bit is all you need to top an event or get your invite. Upstart Goblin is also grounded on the theory that life points don't really matter, and I can't remember if I've actually done a video technically only about life points, but basically there's this theory that life points, just in every game, life points and things like that matter a lot less than board control and tempo, and that's very true in Yu-Gi-Oh! So while you might be looking at Upstart Goblin and say, well, okay, the 1,000 life points though, that is a drawback, in general of all of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, that's not really a factor. Yes, it does matter that you have to do 1,000 more damage, but for many players they realize that that doesn't really affect the overall game unless you're like really short on damage. But if you're playing a really good deck in Yu-Gi-Oh, you should be able to do that 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000, not that you're necessarily going to draw all 3 copies of Upstart Goblin in every single game. So the life point drawback of Upstart Goblin basically doesn't matter. But what's interesting is that if you remember that Commenters Don't Understand Pot of Greed video that I did a while back, a lot of people suggested that the way to make Pot of Greed balanced is to just make it draw 1 card, but we know that doesn't actually work, because if you make Pot of Greed just draw 1 card, it is now a better version of Upstart Goblin, and Upstart Goblin already saw a ton of play. That's just a great example of how Pot of Greed is so overpowered that if you literally cut its effect in half, it is still extremely powerful. So now that you know the basic benefits of playing Upstart Goblin, basically that it just increases the consistency of your deck over the course of many rounds, let's talk about some reasons that people didn't play it in every single deck back when it was at 3 copies per deck. The biggest reason that Upstart Goblin didn't see play is from people not actually wanting to play less than 40 cards. If you think of some of the best decks in the game's history that didn't play Upstart Goblin, the reason that they didn't play Upstart Goblin is because every single card in the deck was so necessary and so powerful, you didn't want to play 37 cards, you wanted to play 40 really, really powerful cards. Now, those situations are few and far between, and in many cases, the players like Patrick Hoban that swore by 3 Upstart Goblin still played Upstart Goblin in the decks that many players did not play the card in. But there are notable players, such as Jeff Jones, that very rarely played Upstart Goblins at 3 copies per deck because they've said in deck profiles that they just prefer having more options with 40 cards. Now, this debate isn't super relevant anymore with only 1 copy of Upstart Goblin, but it's still worth mentioning that the main reason people did not play that card was because they just wanted to play play 40 different cards in their deck instead of 37. Whether or not this was right or not isn't really up for debate, because we've had plenty of people top with 3 Upstart Goblins, plenty of people top without 3 Upstart Goblins, so it's really just a personal preference type deal. Even if something, I mean, this is just a good general tip for people, even if something is mathematically correct, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do it. Just because Upstart Goblin does technically increase the consistency of any deck that you put it into, doesn't mean that you're obligated to play that card in your deck. You don't have to play that card. Another great example of this, just real quick, is that playing 1 copy of Gem Knight Garnet is the mathematically correct way to play the Brilliant Fusion engine. However, many players, many really good players, have topped events using 2 copies of Garnet, because even though that they realize and understand that the card is mathematically better at 1 copy, it just feels better to them to play 2 copies of the card. So this is another reason that not everyone played Upstart Goblin. Just because it was mathematically correct doesn't mean that they have to play it at a tournament. Moving on, let's focus to the now 2018 version of Upstart Goblin, where it's limited, and talk about some of the reasons that it hasn't seen play. So first off, the card makes a lot less impact when it's at 1 copy per deck versus 3 copies per deck. This is obvious with any card, but in the case of Upstart Goblin, when you played it at 3 copies per deck, you actually saw it a pretty reliable amount of the time. You would see that card many times in the first couple turns of the game. Oftentimes you'd go through several Upstart Goblins in the early stages if your deck had a lot of draw power, but at 1 copy per deck, even in decks with draw power, it's hard sometimes seeing that Upstart Goblin. And when you have a card like Upstart Goblin that's just a blank card, if you don't see it over the course of like 20 games that you play at like a regional qualifier, you might be thinking to yourself, well, what if I just cut Upstart Goblin and played another searchable card that would have came up instead? Because if you don't see Upstart Goblin, it doesn't really do anything. It doesn't advance your game state at all. It's just a blank card. So when you play an entire tournament and never draw the card, you might be asking yourself, well, what if I just added a different card instead? So I think at 1 copy per deck, with people seeing it a lot less, they're a lot less likely to actually put the card in their strategy. That 1 out of 1,000 is way lower than 3 out of 1,000, even if it doesn't quite seem like it. It also doesn't help Upstart Goblin that a much better generic draw spell in the form of Pot of Desires exists. Pot of Desires draws 2 cards, and it is worth mentioning that when Upstart Goblin was at 3 and Pot of Desires was at 3, they actually sort of combo with each other, because in the case of Pot of Desires, you don't want to banish your combo pieces, and the Upstart Goblins weren't combo pieces. They were actually the best cards to banish with Desires, because they were just blank cards anyway. But in the case of sort of 2018 decks, many of them aren't even playing Upstart Goblin anymore, they're just playing the Desires, because even though both cards are in fact draw spells, the Pot of Desires drawing 2 cards matters a lot in games where you really just need that extra card. Upstart Goblin is just a 1-for-1. It's not super impactful other than just increasing your consistency, where Pot of Desires can actually get you out of some pretty sticky situations. Furthermore, the new time rules definitely do not help Upstart Goblin. In many cases, you see people just siding out of cards like Solemn Strike and Solemn Judgment when they head into Game 3, because the new time rules that have been out for a couple months now, I guess almost half a year, man, time flies. The new time rules are extremely punishing to any sort of effects that require you to give your opponents life points or for you to pay life points. We've seen time and time again at YCSs and regional qualifiers, people making these huge boards with things like Soul Charge only to lose to the time, because you have only until the end of the phase to actually deal damage to your opponent, and in the case of Soul Charge, you're forced to skip your battle phase. So even though Upstart Goblin doesn't make that much of a difference in life points, it just gives your opponent 1,000. It's not something crazy like Soul Charge for 4 or 5,000. That 1,000 when it comes to time actually can make a huge difference. Things like Gaga Cowboy can only cover an 800 gap, so if you Upstart Goblin and then you Cowboy your opponent and time is called, they're still 200 ahead of you. Even though that is a fringe situation, I will admit that, it is still a situation that is making a lot of players not want to play Upstart Goblin. It's also worth mentioning that over the course of all of its existence, Droll and Lockbird is the most popular right now, and it is an excellent counter, quote unquote, to Upstart Goblin. You don't do it when your opponent activates the Upstart Goblin, you do it after the Upstart Goblin resolves, and then even though your opponent has gotten that 1 draw, now they can't use any of their other search effects, and if you're playing Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2018, you probably realize many decks want to use those other search effects. So in the case of countering Droll and Lockbird, the best way to do it is to play your most impactful search effect first, but if you have to Upstart Goblin into a search effect, Droll and Lockbird can completely shut you down. So what decks are playing Upstart Goblin in 2018? Well, very often you find one copy of Upstart Goblin in Sky Striker decks. If you remember, cards like Sky Striker Engage and all the Sky Striker spells get bonus effects when you have 3 spell cards in your graveyard, and in the case of many of them, those bonus effects are ridiculously powerful. In the case of Engage, it literally turns itself into a Pot of Greed because you get a free +1, and that's pretty crazy. So a blank spell card that you can just activate at any point, like Upstart Goblin, is extremely powerful in that strategy. We also see Upstart Goblin in many of the FTK strategies out there, most notably Danger Dark World FTK, and the reason being is that that deck can literally do infinite damage. It's an FTK strategy, so that 1000 life points from Upstart Goblin never really factors into things, and you can just sort of play a card that digs you deeper into your deck for the more powerful cards like Allure of Darkness, Soul Charge, Monster Reborn, and the Beginning of the End. So Upstart Goblin acts as another free draw for a deck that's full of free draws to hopefully dig that player towards their FTK. And other than that though, you see Upstart Goblin occasionally pop up in combo strategies and things like True Dracos, things that just want one more draw, but overall it's nowhere near the popularity that it was at 3 copies per deck. I think even if the card came back to 2, it would be a lot more popular. It's really interesting because technically speaking, Upstart has all the same benefits at 3 that it does at 1, and that it just slightly boosts the consistency, but it makes a big difference. And I really do think one of the things that I mentioned in this video that makes the biggest difference is that you don't see it as often, because when you see Upstart Goblin more often, you can actually notice the impact, but when you never draw it once in an entire tournament, you don't really think of it as an important card for your strategy. Anyway though, hopefully you guys enjoyed this sort of basic discussion about Upstart Goblin. I didn't really go into the math of it other than the 3 out of 1000 because I feel that point's really important, but there are plenty of videos out there if you're interested in learning about the specifics of how many Upstart Goblins you should play in a deck and the benefit of doing so. I'll see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.